I also am recognizing that sometimes, as we're talking about parts and parts of us and things like that, I recognize I get a part that comes up for me when someone is stuck in their healing journey. And so just for me to recognize that my parts that want to help or my parts that feel helpless can get frustrated with other people. But that doesn't mean that that's true. It doesn't mean that that's accurate. It just means that there's a part of me that can feel upset or bothered by that.
Your dreams will always require your healing, and you need to know that in order to move forward. If you feel stuck in your creativity, your art, your business, or your life, then it's essential to understand that you are being asked to heal what's in the way of you creating what you dream about. This podcast is all about the relationship between your emotional health and your creativity. I'm Courtney Lancaster, and this is the Heal Create podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Heal Create podcast. I am your host. I'm Courtney, and I am excited to have one of my best friends back. She has been on the podcast before. Stephanie Bagato is a licensed marriage and family therapist and now level 1 trained in internal family systems, which is a therapeutic modality that I talk about a lot on this podcast. But I'm so excited to get into our topic today. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm so glad you're here. So a couple of weeks ago, I opened up this conversation about, are we trauma obsessed as a culture? These current generations, are we obsessed with our trauma? If you go on TikTok, like literally everything is a trauma response and everything can be pathologized. And I talked about in that part 1 of how I really do believe, and I think there's a lot of science to support this, and a lot of people that believe this as well, that we're really in an emotional growth spurt as, a society. And that a lot of the reasons why these things are coming up for us are because we have the safety that we haven't had in generations past to be able to look at some of the systemic trauma that we've gone through, but also some of the personal things that we never really had language for or understanding of or resources to deal with. It's an incredible time to be alive. And there's been a lot of pushback around the healing work that a lot of generations have gone through. And I think that pushback, while it feels mostly frustrating to me, I do think it does bring up some good things to think about. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today.
Yeah. I'm really excited to kind of open up this conversation with you and to kind of expand on that part 1. I think that would be really good.
As you've sort of thought about this topic over the last couple of weeks, because I know we've been kind of talking about it, what's come up for you as you've thought about this idea or the pushback from, I think it's fair to say, mostly older generations about mm-hmm. this idea that we're not resilient as a culture, that younger generations are just totally focused on their pain. And what has come up for you as you've thought about this topic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I can't help but look at it in terms of relationally. My assumption is that it is really hard for older generations to hear younger generations talk about it, that it can bring up a lot of shame or insecurity or kind of feelings around they didn't have that opportunity to. You can kind of hear older generations talk about that of we just had to eat our dinner and be thankful about it. We just had to obey our parents. There wasn't a lot of room to question or to learn anything differently. So my guess is that usually that kind of brings up some things, but totally. I also think about the pendulum swing that we talk about too, of in the 80s and 90s, nothing was trauma. We didn't have language for that. We didn't talk about it. And so then when we release that pendulum, it kind of swings sometimes the opposite way, just momentum building, is that, are we swinging? I think that's the fear. Are we swinging into everything as trauma? And so we're trying to settle back down into what is, what isn't, what does that look like? What are we healing from? So that's kind of all the stuff that I've been thinking about or like excited to talk about.
Totally. No, that makes so much sense. Oh, and I know you mentioned the 80s and 90s. Obviously, like for all the decades before that,
Yeah.
there wasn't any language for trauma either. But the reason why you bring that up is because those were the years that we were raised in.
Yeah.
So like we are the first generations that really have the resources to go back and look at what went wrong for us that might have caused some of the unhelpful things that we're experiencing, and with the hope that future generations will be able to benefit from what we know now and won't have to go back and heal. But like this is an essential step towards that.
Yeah.
We also mentioned before we started this podcast that like addiction rates were so much higher, like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, so much higher. Like, because, well, what did they do if they didn't have the tools and resources? Well, they didn't talk about it. And like I mentioned in the last podcast, they didn't have the safety to even have it come up in the first place, or they coped with it. They coped with it in so many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. They coped or they managed the best that they could. And I also think that it might be important too, as we talk about previous generations that may feel offended or hurt by younger generations really looking backwards and what didn't work. We also are able to get to this place because of the work that older generations did do.
Sure. Even if it wasn't directly trauma. Yeah, that's a great point. Totally.
Exactly. That they were able to bring us up to this place to then really question and look and discern what was helpful and what wasn't.
Totally. Yeah, that it is such a good point. I have thought about that for myself too, of all of the systems that I, deconstructed and looked into and burned down. I actually did have systems to burn down in the first place. Like there were a lot of really, really good things that I was raised in that did have some painful consequences. But the fact that I was, and a lot of us were raised in the structures that we were raised in, even if you look at like 90s parenting, it was so much about behavior. And like even that we know now is like can be such a, shame pool. But that is a great point about older generations and understanding that like they did the best that they could. And we are actually able to do what we're doing because of of the work that they did and the progress. And we are progressing as a human species. So one of the complaints, the biggest one that I've heard, is the lack of resiliency in our culture. And I wonder what thoughts you might have about that, about the complaint that we are not resilient in this generation, that we are, get stuck, or that we're victims or whatever. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah. When I hear that question, I look at it from a lot of angles. So I look at it as like a mom, and then I look at it and being afraid of that for my kids. And I look at that as a therapist and as an individual. So I think that they all kind of overlap and work together. But I think if we look at the definition of what resiliency is, that it's, we're able to withstand and recover quickly. That's kind of like the two pieces of resiliency. I think that when we avoid our trauma or we discount it or minimize it, we're not actually able to recognize and realize how to withstand something and recover quickly, because we're ignoring it. We're ignoring that we have had hurtful experiences or harmful experiences. So in order to be resilient, I actually think we need to face it. We need to heal through our experiences that were hurtful and harmful. So this idea that we can't build resiliency if everything is trauma, I think that they actually work together.
Yes. Yeah, totally. You can't have resiliency if you aren't doing the work to heal what made you feel like you couldn't get through it in the first place.
Yeah. If we can't withstand something, we don't know we're capable. We don't know that we're powerful. We don't know. I mean, trauma really takes away our choice and our power. And so when we're healing from that, we recognize that we have power. And where do we have it? And where can we implement that? We are empowered at that point. And so I think that that's a really important part of healing in any capacity, but especially when it comes to trauma, is that we build resiliency upon that. That's how we know we're powerful and capable. We work through it.
And people that don't believe that they're resilient, there are reasons for that. There are painful reasons why a kid would grow up to be an adult who feels like they can't get through hard things. An adult that feels like they can't get through like anything, everything feels like too overstimulating, too much, even like too much of an inconvenience. I can see how, without an understanding of how a kid would grow up to be an adult like that, you would feel maybe disgusted, maybe annoyed, maybe they're taking more of your perceived resources, whatever the trigger is around those people. Without an understanding of how that happens, I could see that. But at the same time, when you understand that the reasons why that actually happens is because of such a lack of connection growing up, such a lack of safety and somebody with you and compassion, then it's really hard not to see that person or people like that with so much compassion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That when people tend to maybe have that victim mentality is usually referencing that there is a time frame in their life, usually young, where they were a victim or they were unable to get through something. Yes, they were
actually a victim.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing it in present day and we're like, what's their problem or what's going on with them? When really it really is revealing something younger, an experience that was real and valid when they were younger, playing out in present day.
Yeah, totally. I know it's even hard for me to get angry at the kind of victim mentality where people just aren't moving forward at all.
Yeah.
Where they're, really stuck, or they really think the whole world's against them, or they're really like stuck in that shame. It's not a place that's healthy to stay.
Yeah.
But it's hard to be annoyed when you know what that person had to have gone through to get to that point. I think the problem is when that becomes the identity of the person. Would you say?
Yeah. When there really isn't a lot of room to have differing opinions or views, like when you talk to someone about being empowered or where they are capable and there's pushback from that person, I think that can be really hard and challenging for the person who's listening or for the person who's engaged in relationship with them. But I think really we move towards compassion and understanding to support them in that journey for them.
Right. Yeah, totally. Well, we do because we're in the profession, but I could see how people that are like, what the hell is all of this? are like, guys, get it together, move forward. And I think that's like the, I don't know if this has happened for you, but I've had clients who have been like, my aunt was telling me like, I should be over it by now. Or like my church was saying like, I'm too obsessed with trauma. Or like someone sent me a podcast saying like, make resiliency cool again. Stop focusing on your pain so much. And like, am I doing this wrong? Am I like, what's going on? And that was really what kind of sparked this whole topic in the first place. And so what would you say is like signs of well-being or signs of moving through trauma resolution productively?
Yeah, I think what comes up for me as I hear you ask that question is showing signs of moving towards the thing that they're healing and moving into more of their authentic essence of who they are, who God created them to be. When we see signs of that, that's where we, even if it's small, little instances of that, and you can use all kinds of language, but like grounded, secure, safe version of yourself out in the world or with people, I think that's where you recognize that you are moving towards something. Is it always like that? No, on a healing journey, it's kind of like like a corkscrew. When we look at progress, I think a lot of us look at it as kind of this linear upward trajectory that as soon as I'm on my healing journey, everything will always get better and better and better and better. And it's kind of good news, bad news when we realize it's not like that at all. It's more of a corkscrew, and that things we will feel we're moving towards a direction, we're progressing, and then we have kind of this backward
coil.
spiral. Yeah, coil.
Yeah, totally.
That feels scary and threatening of like, oh no, am I back to square one? But really, that's part of healing. It's part of the progress that we are moving towards our authentic self. Those are signs when we have little glimpses and instances of being our most authentic version of us in our lives. That's how we know we're heading towards and moving through healing.
Yeah. What are some other signs of, like, if somebody would be like, am I doing this right? Like, am I okay? Like, is this, I'm asking a lot of questions about my childhood. I'm noticing that a lot of the habits that I have are actually like survival habits or habits out of fear. What other signs might you point them towards or help them like ask, around for to kind of see if they're moving in a healthy direction and not like, as opposed to like identifying with your pain or staying stuck or like shrinking? Like what are some of the things that you would have them look for?
Yeah, I think once we identify that there is pain, that's the first step, especially when we come from complex trauma and family relational trauma. That's a really hard one to even recognize that we had things that were really hurtful and harmful or unhelpful growing up. So that first identifying it is really helpful. And then the kind of wrestling with this healing part of it, the things that were hurtful, the things that were unhelpful, sitting with those feelings. And we use that a lot. It's kind of this ambiguous term of like sitting with our feelings and our pain. But it's kind of this idea of learning how to be present with the younger versions of us or present with the versions of us that experienced pain. So it's kind of learning and building upon that muscle of how to tolerate our own feelings. And so the more that people are building and building and building, and that's the thing I always want to emphasize with my clients and with others, is that it's not all or nothing. It's not we had pain, we couldn't deal with any of it, and now we're dealing with all of it. It's not like that. It's very small doses of learning how to build upon skills and tools and things like that of how to be present with yourself and your pain and your experiences throughout your life.
Yeah.
So I think when people know kind of the roadmap, does it look different for people? Sure. But when we can kind of normalize that there's a lot of feelings that come up, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of sadness and grieving, when we can kind of normalize that and people start recognizing it, I think they're able to point out, oh, this was a time that I would have responded this way and I didn't this time. And those are all part of the healing
That's a
journey.
great one. Yeah, totally. We can learn from people who are maybe concerned about trauma obsession as we can just take a little inventory of, are we identifying with our learned helplessness in a way that's not actually productive and not so basically, and just going back even to internal family systems, we have an adult part of us, our true authentic self, and then we have these younger parts of us, and we all have lots of parts, and there's fearful parts and insecure parts and angry parts of us. And I think a lot of us unknowingly are kind of living in younger parts. But when we're on a healing journey, the journey is to really, really, really orient to your authentic self and then to reparent these younger parts. That's a very basic internal family systems kind of. There's a reason why I want to kind of set this up. But do you have anything to add to what internal family systems is?
Yeah, no, I think you did a really lovely job of kind of boiling it down into what, because I think when we're present with our younger parts of us, I think another part another word that's coming to my mind is like witnessing what those younger parts experienced. So that's a
Totally.
really important part, is your adult version, your full essence, your authentic self is able to witness and be present with the younger versions of you that experience
Yes. And
something.
because, yeah, that's a really important part of healing is when you understand, oh, there's lots of different parts of me. And I'm not like 5,000, just like, there's more than two. There's more than one or two. There's like, oh, I react this way in these kinds of situations, and I get anxious in these kinds of situations, and I get angry in these kinds of situations. You kind of, when you start to pay attention long enough, it feels incredibly chaotic and messy to begin this work. There's, dozens of kids screaming at me all the time. It feels like, can feel really chaotic and really messy. But and when you're in that season, I said this in my last podcast, when you're in that season of beginning the work of really differentiating between your adult self and your child self, if somebody were to pause my process at those particular moments of me beginning, even within the first couple of years, and they probably did, but they would have said, oh my gosh, she's gone off the deep end. Like, she is like all she's reading is trauma textbooks, and all she's talking about is trauma, and all she's doing is, crying. And I definitely did not do it perfectly or even very well at the beginning, but it was just a part of my process.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think even for mine, so I'm in a healing journey now, and I would say that there's been several different versions of this, but right now the way that mine is looking too is that I denied so much of my experience. I denied so much of the severity and the intensity of my experience.
Like,
and
I'm
so,
fine.
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah. And that was necessary and helpful to get me to here. But I think we don't want to do that. That's not a long-term solution. That's not a sustainable way of dealing with that. And so I think the idea of being trauma obsessed just looks different than someone who is recognizing, referencing, exposing, their actual lived experience of trauma. I think that those can I think people can be afraid that those look the same. Being stuck in it versus I did have these experiences and now I'm healing them. And part of that is talking about it.
Yeah.
Is referencing it, is learning about it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you feel really upended and disoriented.
Yeah.
That is true, because through trauma, our authentic selves, our most highest versions of us get kind of lost in the shuffle of that. We experience trauma that makes us question who we really are.
Yeah.
So we're trying to turn right side up again through learning or talking or discussing or therapy or being in safe, healthy relations. We're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Because so much of our identity was in question. I also am recognizing that sometimes, as we're talking about parts and parts of us and things like that, I recognize I get a part that comes up for me when someone is stuck in their healing journey. And so just for me to recognize that my parts that want to help or my parts that feel helpless can get frustrated with other people. But that doesn't mean that that's true. It doesn't mean that that's accurate. It just means that there's a part of me that can feel upset or bothered by that.
Which is the thing that I guess I haven't wanted to directly say, but that the people that are complaining about those doing trauma work are possibly acting out of a wounded part of themselves.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a way around it.
I don't know that there's a way around saying that either.
I know. And I just think it would be just so helpful when all of us just recognize we all have parts and we all have parts that come up often.
Yeah.
But that's a normal experience.
Yeah.
And so that's our first step, is when we realize if someone feels stuck in their process and I'm feeling feelings about that, that's my first step. What is it about this that feels hard for me?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, right. It's it's a very delicious cut through question. Like, that person's so annoying. Oh, shoot. Like, why is that a threat to me? Because annoyed is a triggered response, which
Yeah.
means that a younger part of you is showing up. And the whole reason why I wanted to bring up internal family systems and kind of get that foundation in the first place is because I was trying to, like, if we play devil's advocate and say, okay, well, what are the valid parts of their complaints? It
Yeah.
would be if you look at internal family systems, if we are becoming a young part of us and seeing the
Mm.
world through a wounded part of us and not willing to see that things could be another way because we're just, maybe people help us more when we're in this wounded part,
Yeah.
or maybe we don't have to do as much when we're in this wounded part, then that would not be the optimal functioning for your human existence. And that's a
Yeah.
valid thing to point out. Like, oh, let's be careful that we don't get stuck
Hmm.
in these younger parts. And being stuck in these younger parts, like you said, when there's like pushback, like there's one thing to be like, oh, Steph, I'm really stuck in in a wounded part. I need to like figure out a way to get my adult self online. Like that's one thing. But to
Hmm.
be like, nope, everything is terrible. The world is against me. Nobody likes me. This is never going to happen for me. And I'm just going to wait for someone to rescue me. Again, the compassion for people that are in that situation, what they had to have learned about themselves to learn that level of disempowerment is
Yeah.
tragic. And at the same time, we want to continue to like encourage those people, or if it's yourself, encourage yourself. This is not the end of the road. It can't be.
Mm. Yeah, I really love the way that you just said that because that brings with it hope. When we move towards compassion, the way that you just said that, of it's not the end of the story, that's compassion. I think
Yeah.
where I feel the conversation tends to go is more judgment or
Yes.
more don't get stuck there or be careful that you don't get stuck. And we
Yeah.
just know that what ends up happening is that we feel judged. We feel
Yeah.
like we have to hide or avoid things. And so you're right. There can be important parameters that kind of
Yeah.
conversation is reminding us of. I just think how the conversation ends up going is that it does feel a little bit more be careful or you better not, kind of more judgmental.
Yeah, and you had kind of talked about like devil's advocate, like, well, what if they were all trauma responses?
Yeah.
Like, what are we afraid of in that being true? You were talking about this idea of you had kind of experienced the same sort of judgment from older generations around coddling your kids
Yeah.
and around like all we do is coddle our kids and we're giving them what they want and we're not putting these boundaries down and we're not spanking and we're not blah 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 blah. And you had experienced pushback from that as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I've experienced in my own family. Also experienced it with clients that are afraid of coddling their kids. And so I can hear when we, process that and talk about that, it's usually because that's what their parents said. Like we don't want to coddle you or don't coddle your kids or things like that. And so there really is this fear that we're raising a generation or that we are becoming coddled ourselves. And so there is kind of this judgmental, negative view of being coddled or coddling,
Yeah.
our kids and what that would mean.
Yeah. Right. And so the way that you dealt with that was kind of the same way that you said you were thinking about this whole idea of the judgment that people are getting for being trauma obsessed was like, okay, what if we are?
Mm-hmm.
What did you kind of come up with when you went through that experience of like thinking that way about the whole coddling experience?
Yeah, I think when I really sat with that, okay, what if we are everything is a trauma response and we are really kind of entertaining this idea that everything is a trauma response. I think for me it really did come down to fear that if we coddled our kids, if everything is a trauma response, that people would be stuck, and then if they're stuck, then they're not functioning. And so then I'm
Mm-hmm.
afraid for that person if they're not going to be functioning or they're not able.
Why would they be afraid of that? What did you find?
I'm thinking about my own fear versus what I think more globally, what we're afraid of. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, we can just apply it to this idea of like, we're not resilient. What are you actually afraid of? Because it comes in so much judgment, but like, just like how you brought up with experiencing like complaints about coddling your kids, realizing that like those complaints were coming from people that were afraid. I think that as far as resiliency goes, or lack of resiliency, what I feel like certain people are afraid of, especially older generations, having to look at some of the ways that they parented us, the guilt, maybe the pain that they have around what they did or didn't do. I think that there's subconscious fear about that. I'm sure you have clients whose parents do not support therapy or like think like, well, I was a good mom and I did the best I could. There's that. I think there's fear that that subconscious fear of just not wanting to look at their own pain, just in general.
Yeah.
I think that does scare a lot of people who just were like the very much press on, like, nope, you just put it behind you and you move forward. And like the more that we realize like, oh, that's actually incredibly unhealthy and what people in survival do, then there's like that feeling of dread of like, oh shoot, like am I going to have to actually face the things that happened to me? And if people aren't willing to do that, or it feels like too much, then we do move into like, we know this from all sorts of systemic problems, that then we move towards like judgment, we other people, we separate ourselves, and we start to point out what's wrong with the people that are different from us.
Absolutely. I also think, in addition to fear, maybe this is a part of it, is the grieving for yourself, like the lost time, or the grieving of the way that you did function and you didn't know that there's another way. And so I do think that it also brings up a lot of room for our own grief and the way that we experience things, or the way that we were parented, or the beliefs that we had that we may change. We actually have to grieve that when we start changing and shifting.
Yeah. And if you're watching your kids or your grandkids, like actually grieve things, or like really look at their past, or like disconnection they might have experienced, and are looking to heal that and resolve that. I think that there's maybe guilt that comes up from that.
Yeah.
And then there's, the fear of like, are you going to look through your childhood and realize that I was bad and then separate from me?
Yeah.
That's that fear there. And a lot of that takes a lot of self-awareness to know why you do the things that you do, which again, generations in the past didn't have the luxury of self-awareness like we do.
Right.
So much compassion on those that are in that judgmental place towards us, towards us trauma-obsessed people. I wanted to read something. It's from an article I sent to you. It's called Make Resiliency Cool Again. And it says, in our therapeutic age, everything is pathologized, from shoplifting to drug use to having a bad day. One can see the appeal. Delegating responsibility for your own bad behavior to some academic-sounding diagnosis can be quite convenient if you don't mind sacrificing your self-respect. Barf. But were we to follow this line of thinking to a logical conclusion, I don't think we'd like where it leads. I shudder to imagine what else might be a trauma response, and therefore not our fault, and therefore totally acceptable, and therefore deserving of accommodation, and therefore helplessly chronic. Being rude is a trauma response. Self-absorption is a trauma response. Being shy on a first date is a trauma response. Showing up late to an interview is a trauma response. Voting for Donald Trump is a trauma response. Not voting for Donald Trump is a trauma response. Inflicting trauma is a trauma response. It might be funny if it weren't so psychologically poisonous. Lovely. This would probably be like the worst of the worst.
Yes.
Type of judgment. And it's very common. It's not like one tiny corner of the internet. This is why we wanted to talk about this. What do you notice about what I just read? What comes up for you?
Yeah, I definitely see that the way that it gets inflated and gets inflated pretty big and intensely is that no one would take responsibility. And if no one
Yeah,
took
you can hear the
responsibility,
fear that she has.
100%.
Then
And if no one
everything's
took
okay.
yeah, exactly. If no one took responsibility, then everything's okay. Then people would be traumatized. We would inflict trauma on other people because we're ourselves traumatized. And then it's just going to spiral out of control and everyone's going to walk around traumatized. Like you could just hear it.
Totally, which is actually not a marker of wellness.
Right.
That is not the point of resolving trauma. That's not what happens when you resolve trauma.
Yeah. And I actually think you bring up a good point is that maybe there weren't a lot of conversations talking about the healing of trauma. And
Like
so
what actually happens when you heal. Yeah.
yeah. And then it's possible that we're not
Right.
just walking around because of our trauma, bleeding out everywhere that we go. And so I do think you're right. Holding that there are conversations like this that are very judgmental and harsh and not accurate, but it's because maybe there haven't been a lot of conversations that we can heal and move through our trauma, that is possible, that we can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that if there was a way for you to live full of compassion and creativity and connection, and you were going to have to face some of the things, which is technically trauma, that keep you from being in that state most of the time, then that might be a path worth looking at and worth following.
Yeah.
So it sounds like what she's afraid of, or what maybe people in this camp are afraid of, is what she talked about: bad behavior becoming, well, I mean, just she's talking about like the degradation of society, really.
Right.
Like the whole downfall of, all civilization being because we're blaming our trauma for our bad behavior. But that's not actually what healing is about. And I have to think about, if you really thought everything's going to fall apart if we keep doing this, whatever this quote unquote is, then I might be the same way, like, oh, you're afraid. You're really afraid of what's going to happen. You don't have a clear picture of what healthy trauma resolve is.
Right. Right. No, I totally agree with you. I think that really is, and why it's necessary for us to talk about what trauma healing
Yeah.
looks like and the roadmap of that, so that people aren't afraid of this
Right.
huge unraveling of society
Yeah.
and taking responsibility and harming other people because of that.
Yeah. Because I know you've gone through a lot of healing in your lifetime. What's the most exciting benefit that you've experienced as you have gone on the journey of resolving some of the trauma that you've experienced?
Really experiencing what it feels like to be my actual self, my really grounded, safe, secure, hopeful self. However, I'm thinking that if I would have heard that before, I don't know that it would have made sense to me until I experienced what it
Yeah.
felt like to be me.
What does it feel like?
There's so many things the way that it feels. I'm trying to embody that. I mean, I think that that's part of it. It feels really embodied and it feels really exciting and connecting, even when it's hard, even when the things that I'm working through are really, really tough. Knowing that there's a version of me that really can be present feels really empowering and exciting, of like, oh, there's a version of me that's not afraid of this experience, or there's a version of me that knows what to do here. I felt so much of my life before I only ever knew how to be a people pleaser, or I only ever knew how to be certain, to show up in certain ways. I didn't know that there were other options that felt more aligned with who I actually was. And so experiencing kind of myself for the first time ever has been really exciting and really
Yeah.
worth it. Something I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know was possible before.
Yeah. What are some of the personality traits of your authentic self?
I think parts of myself that I didn't realize are like that I'm silly or playful or that I am powerful. I think I was always really afraid of being seen. And
Mm.
so I tried to hide that a lot and be invisible to
Mm-hmm.
that. And so just recognizing parts of myself that were really forgotten or parts of myself that were kind of locked away. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm rediscovering those and incorporating them has been really exciting. And so playfulness was one of the first ones that I really locked away when I was young.
Yeah.
And so getting to bring that one back has been really just sweet, has been really a sweet part of my journey.
That's a good one to bring up because playfulness, I think, is like I mean, I guess we all have different ways of expressing playfulness, but it is a pretty common experience of like people that notice more safety internally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the amount of safety that you need, you think about how vulnerable a kid playing is. They're not on guard at all.
Yeah.
They're not on guard. They're not waiting for the other shoe to drop. They're not looking behind them. They're not worried. They know there's a mom around keeping an eye on them, and they can go fully into their silliness and their imagination and their connection
Mm-hmm.
and creativity. That amount of internal safety that you need to create with your, as an adult, if you've experienced any level of trauma, is pretty profound.
Yeah.
So the fact that you've done the work to experience more playfulness is so, so huge. And I think that the people that we're trying to address or maybe defend against in this podcast episode just need to know that like playfulness is on the other side
Yeah.
of this, not the
Yeah.
dissolution of organized civilization,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like healthy people actually create really beautiful things.
And are connected.
Yeah, right. To each other
Yeah.
and themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Playfulness is a big one. I remember learning about that I think one time I read it, it was like playfulness is the opposite of trauma. And I was like, what? And then realizing the vulnerability of that and how not having structure
Yeah.
to like have it be whatever it's going to be is real. Like the more that I learned about it, the more I'm like, of course it is. Like, of course
Right.
it's on the other side of feeling so free and embodied and present and courageous, connected, all of those things you need in play. Right.
Well, thank you guys for joining us today. I hope that if you have those people in your life that are maybe discouraging your therapy journey or maybe accusing you of being obsessed with trauma, that you could see them with a little bit of compassion and realizing what they might be afraid of, even if it's coming up in anger. Do you have anything to add as far as encouragement to people who might be discouraged by friends or family?
Yeah. Yeah. There really are really beautiful spaces that welcome you on your journey. And so finding those spaces might be another part that's really important, is finding really safe, welcoming, compassionate spaces to support you on your healing journey. And even though we may have compassion for those that are saying we're stuck in trauma, it doesn't mean that we have to be responsible for their view or responsible for their feelings, even if we have compassion towards them. Your job at that point when you're on that healing journey is to heal. That's your job at that point.
Amen. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope that you have such a beautiful weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Heal Create podcast. If you have enjoyed this podcast at all, we would love if you would subscribe, rate it, send it to your friends. That would really help us get this message out, this message of empowering people towards emotionally sustainable creativity.
Also, we have a PDF for you. So there's an exercise that I created called inspiration mirroring. And basically, it is for those that are looking to get acquainted with their authentic, truest self, based on the idea that whatever inspires you embodies your potential. And so if you want to get started on that journey today of really understanding who you are at your core, the person that you hope you are, then you can go to the link in my bio on Instagram or go to my website and download that PDF. I think that's all. Have a beautiful day.